I arrived at Oakwood Cemetery just before dawn, when the mist still clung to the headstones like reluctant ghosts. The iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, a sound that seemed to underscore the weight I carried in my chest. At 45, I had become accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals with a mere nod. Yet here, among the dead, I felt small and powerless. The gravel crunched beneath my Italian leather shoes as I made my way down the familiar path to my mother's grave. 5 years had passed since her funeral, but the pain remained as fresh as that rainy April morning when they lowered her casket into the ground. I hadn't cried then, couldn't, really, surrounded by business associates and distant relatives who knew Elizabeth Morgan only as the mother of tech mogul James Morgan, CEO of Morgan Innovations. "Good morning, Mom," I whispered, placing a bundle of lilies, her favorite, against the smooth granite of her tombstone. The marble gleamed in the weak morning light, the inscription simple yet elegant, Elizabeth and Morgan, 1952 to 2020, beloved mother. I brushed away a few fallen leaves from the base of the stone, my fingers tracing the carved letters of her name. The cemetery was silent except for the occasional chirp of early birds and the distant hum of Boston waking up beyond the iron fence. Here, in this quiet corner of the city, time seemed to slow, allowing memories to surface that I usually kept buried beneath spreadsheets and conference calls. I remembered Sunday afternoons in our small apartment in Dorchester, Mom humming old Beatles songs while kneading bread dough, flour dusting her cheeks. She'd worked 2 jobs then, receptionist by day and waitress by night, all to ensure I had everything I needed. The scholarship to MIT had been my ticket out, and her proud smile at my graduation had been worth all those sleepless nights hunched over textbooks. The company hit $10 billion in valuation last month, I told her, settling down on the damp grass, heedless of what it might do to my tailored suit. "You wouldn't believe the new headquarters, Mom. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, our rooftop garden. You'd have loved the herb section. I made sure they planted rosemary, like you used to grow on our windowsill." The wind picked up, rustling through the maple trees that line the cemetery paths. For a moment, I could almost hear her gentle laugh, the way she'd tease me about working too hard. "Life isn't measured in stock options, Jamie," she'd say, using the childhood nickname I'd outgrown, but secretly missed. I pulled out my phone out of habit, checking the 47 unread emails that had accumulated since I'd left my Beacon Hill penthouse an hour ago. The board meeting was at 9, and Henderson would be presenting the quarterly projections. I should review them again before, damn it, I muttered, shoving the phone back into my pocket. This was exactly what she would have scolded me for. Even here, at her grave, I couldn't seem to disconnect from the empire I'd built. The empire that had gradually created a chasm between us in her final years. I closed my eyes, trying to recall her face without the assistance of the framed photograph on my office desk. It frightened me how the details were beginning to blur, the exact shade of her eyes, the pattern of laugh lines around her mouth. Time was stealing her from me piece by piece. I should have visited more, I admitted to the silent stone. Those last few years. I was always promising to come for Sunday dinner, always canceling at the last minute. Some emergency at work, some deal that couldn't wait. I swallowed hard against the lump forming in my throat. I thought we had more time. That was the cruel joke of success. It gave you everything except the one thing you couldn't buy back: time. I had penthouses in 3 cities, a fleet of cars I rarely drove, and enough money to last several lifetimes. Yet I'd missed my mother's 60th birthday because of an investor meeting in Tokyo. I'd cut short our last Christmas together to handle a product crisis. And when the hospital called about her sudden heart attack, I was in the middle of a board meeting and didn't check my phone until 2 hours later. Too late. Always too late. A robin landed on the edge of her headstone, regarding me with curious eyes before fluttering away. The sky was lightening now, the mist beginning to lift. In an hour, I needed to be back in my other world, the world of glass and steel, of mergers and acquisitions, of people who called me Mr. Morgan and jumped when I entered a room. But for now, I sat in silence, letting memories wash over me like waves. The time she taught me to ride a bike in Franklin Park, running alongside until I found my balance. The night she stayed up helping me finish a science project due the next day, both of us punchy with exhaustion by morning. Her voice singing me to sleep during thunderstorms that rattled our apartment windows. "I made it, Mom," I said softly. "Everything you wanted for me. The success, the security." I trailed off, realizing the hollowness of those words. What she had truly wanted was for me to be happy, to find meaning beyond the relentless pursuit of more. On that count, I wasn't sure I'd succeeded at all. I reached out, my fingers tracing the dates carved into the stone. 68 years. It seemed both so long and terribly brief, a life condensed to two numbers separated by a hyphen. What would that hyphen contain for me when my time came? Acquisitions and IPOs? Or moments of genuine connection, of purpose beyond profit margins? The cemetery was still empty of other visitors, though soon the groundskeepers would arrive to begin their daily maintenance. This early morning pilgrimage had become something of a ritual for me in recent months, a way to reconnect with a simpler time, before the weight of my success had become a wall between myself and everything authentic. I sat in the growing light, letting the familiar ache of loss wash through me rather than fighting it as I usually did. In boardrooms and business journals, I was James Morgan, the ruthless innovator who had revolutionized medical technology with neural interface systems that had made treatment of previously incurable conditions possible. Here, I was just Jamie, a son who missed his mother and wondered if she would recognize the man he had become. "I'm trying, Mom," I whispered, standing reluctantly as the distant church bell tolled 6 times. My driver would be waiting at the gates, ready to whisk me back to my carefully scheduled life. I'm trying to remember what matters. As I turned to leave, the first true ray of sunlight broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. For just a moment, I felt a sense of peace, a brief respite from the constant noise in my head. I had come seeking connection with the past, but perhaps what I truly needed was to reconsider my future. I was just about to leave when I heard it, a soft rustling of leaves that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. Turning, I noticed a small figure weaving between the headstones about 30 feet away. A child, moving with the curious mix of caution and fearlessness that only the very young possess. For a moment, I considered slipping away. My time for reflection was over, and Diane, my executive assistant, had already sent 2 texts reminding me about the board meeting. But something about the solitary child made me pause. It was unusual to see anyone in the cemetery this early, let alone a child alone. The girl appeared to be about 8 or 9, with dark braided hair and a blue jacket that seemed a size too large for her slender frame. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers, clearly gathered from the meadow that bordered the eastern edge of Oakwood. As I watched, she approached a weathered gravestone about 10 yards from my mother's and carefully placed the flowers at its base. There was something oddly familiar about her profile that I couldn't quite place. Perhaps she reminded me of someone from the charity foundation we'd established for underprivileged children in Boston's South End. I'd attended enough fundraisers and ribbon cuttings to have met hundreds of families, though I rarely remembered names or faces beyond what was necessary for the photo opportunities. I checked my watch, 7:15. The board wouldn't be happy if I was late, but something kept me rooted to the spot, watching as the girl knelt by the grave and began speaking in soft tones I couldn't make out. The intimacy of the moment made me feel like an intruder, yet I couldn't look away. When was the last time I'd witnessed something so genuinely uncalculated, so free from agenda? The girl suddenly looked up, as if sensing my presence. Our eyes met across the dewy grass, and neither of us moved for several seconds. Then, to my surprise, she stood and began walking directly toward me. I straightened my tie in a reflexive gesture, the corporate armor I donned whenever approaching an unpredictable situation. "Hello," she said when she reached me, her voice clear and unafraid. Up close, I could see her eyes were a deep brown, serious beyond her years, but with a spark of curiosity. "Are you visiting someone too?" "Yes," I answered, gesturing vaguely toward my mother's grave. "My mother." The girl nodded solemnly. "I'm visiting my grandma. I never met her, but Dad says she was really nice. He says I have her smile." "I'm sure that's a lovely thing to have," I replied, surprised at how easily the words came. I rarely engaged with children. They weren't exactly fixtures in the venture capital circuit or tech development labs where I spent most of my time. "Do you come here a lot?" she asked, looking at me with frank assessment. There was something disarming about her directness, so different from the carefully calibrated conversations that filled my days. "When I can, not as often as I should." I glanced toward the cemetery gates, where I knew Carson would be waiting with the car. "And you? Does your father bring you often?" She shook her head. "Dad doesn't know I'm here. He gets sad when he talks about Grandma. I live with Aunt Sarah on Maple Street. It's close enough to walk." She paused, then added with a hint of pride, "I'm very responsible. I look both ways and everything." I frowned slightly, concerns about an unsupervised child momentarily overriding my usual reluctance to get involved in strangers' lives. "Does your aunt know you're here?" "She's sleeping. She works night shifts at the hospital." The girl bent to pick up a smooth pebble from the path, turning it over in her small hands. I left a note. "I do this sometimes. It's peaceful here." The statement, so adult in its sentiment, caught me off guard. I remembered feeling the same way when I first started visiting my mother's grave, finding an unexpected serenity among the monuments to lives past. Most adults I knew would never describe a cemetery as peaceful. They avoided such places, treating death as something to be ignored rather than accepted. "I'm Lily," she said suddenly, extending her hand with formal gravity. "James," I replied, shaking her hand gently, struck by the absurdity of the situation. James Morgan, whose handshake had sealed billion-dollar deals across 3 continents, exchanging pleasantries with a pint-sized cemetery visitor before breakfast. Lily tilted her head, studying me with unexpected intensity. "You look sad," she observed. "My dad looks like that sometimes. He tries to hide it, but I can tell." I opened my mouth to deliver one of my standard deflections, the kind I used with overeager reporters or concerned board members. "I'm fine," just focused on the next quarter's projections, but found I couldn't form the words. There was something about this child's unflinching gaze that made polite falsehoods seem impossible. "I suppose I am a bit sad," I admitted, surprising myself. "This place brings up memories." Lily nodded like this made perfect sense. "That's why I come too. Even though I never met my grandma, I feel like I'm making memories with her when I visit. Dad says she watches over us." My phone vibrated in my pocket, undoubtedly another message from Diane. The real world intrusive as always. Yet I found myself reluctant to break this strange interlude. "Which grave is your grandmother's?" I asked, glancing toward where I'd seen her kneeling earlier. "Over there." Lily pointed to a modest headstone partially shaded by a young maple tree. "The one with the angel on top." Her name was Margaret, but everyone called her Maggie. I squinted at the grave marker, trying to make out the details from a distance. Something about the location nagged at me. It was in the older section of the cemetery, where my mother's family plot was located. Many of the Morgans from previous generations were buried there, though I'd never paid much attention to those more distant relations. "Would you like to see it?" Lily asked, already starting in that direction without waiting for my answer. I hesitated only briefly before following. A text could wait. Henderson could handle the board for 15 minutes if necessary. In 20 years of relentless work, I had rarely allowed myself such an unscheduled detour. As we approached the grave, I could see it was well-maintained despite its age. The stone angel on top had weathered gracefully, its features softened but still discernible. Lily's wildflowers lay at its base alongside what appeared to be previously placed offerings, a small smooth stone, a weathered baseball card protected in plastic, a tiny handmade bracelet of colorful beads. "Dad says Grandma Maggie loved simple things," Lily explained, noticing my gaze on the items. "So we bring her simple presents instead of fancy flowers from shops." I nodded, then froze as my eyes caught the inscription on the headstone: Margaret Elizabeth Donovan, 1922 to 1987. Beloved mother and grandmother. Forever in our hearts. Donovan. My mother's maiden name. "What did you say your full name was?" I asked, my voice suddenly hoarse. "Lily Donovan," she replied, looking up at me with mild surprise at my changed tone. "Lily Margaret Donovan. I'm named after Grandma." My mind raced through possibilities. Donovan wasn't an uncommon name in Boston, particularly among Irish-American families. It could be a coincidence. Yet the location, so close to my family's plot. "And your father?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "What's his name?" "Thomas," she said, kneeling to adjust the placement of her wildflowers. "Tommy to his friends. He works on boats at the harbor." Thomas. My mother had mentioned a Thomas once or twice over the years, a relative's child she'd lost touch with. I'd paid little attention, too absorbed in my own ascent to care about distant family connections. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you," Lily said suddenly, mistaking my silence for annoyance. She stood and brushed grass from her knees. "I better get back before Aunt Sarah wakes up." "No, you're not bothering me at all," I said quickly. "I was just thinking, your grandmother's grave is very close to my family's plot." Lily looked at me with renewed interest. "Really? Maybe they knew each other." "Maybe they did," I agreed, my mind still trying to process the implications. Could this child be connected to me somehow? A distant cousin, perhaps? The timing would make sense if Margaret was my mother's aunt or great-aunt. "I should go," Lily said, glancing toward the cemetery gates. "Aunt Sarah checks on me when she wakes up." "Wait," I said, reaching into my pocket for a business card before realizing how absurd that would be. What 8-year-old carries business cards? Instead, I asked, "Does your father ever visit here too?" "On Sundays sometimes," she replied. "When he's not working. He sits with Grandma and tells her about our week." Sunday. Today was Friday. I could come back, perhaps meet this Thomas, and determine if there was indeed a family connection. Part of me wondered why I cared. I had deliberately distanced myself from family entanglements years ago, finding them incompatible with my ambitions. Yet something about this chance encounter felt significant in ways I couldn't articulate. "It was nice meeting you, Lily Margaret Donovan," I said, offering my hand again. She shook it with a smile that suddenly made my heart lurch. There, in the curve of her mouth and the slight dimple in her left cheek, I saw my mother's smile, the same one that beamed from the photograph on my desk. Before I could process this recognition, Lily turned and began making her way toward the cemetery gates, her small figure moving confidently between the gravestones. I stood rooted in place, watching her go, my carefully ordered world feeling suddenly, inexplicably shaken. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss, yet too fantastic to immediately accept. I looked back at Margaret Donovan's grave, then at my mother's nearby, and felt as if some long-dormant connection was stirring to life between them and between the living who still visited them. I didn't make it to the board meeting that morning. For the first time in my 15 years as CEO, I called in and delegated my responsibilities without offering a detailed explanation. Diane's shock was audible even through the phone speaker, but she recovered quickly. "Are you ill, Mr. Morgan?" The concern in her voice was genuine beneath the professional veneer. "No, Diane. I have a personal matter to attend to." The words felt foreign in my mouth. Personal matters had never taken precedence over Morgan innovations. After hanging up, I remained in the cemetery, sitting on a bench near my mother's grave. The neat rows of headstones stretched out before me, stories buried beneath the ground while the world continued its relentless pace above. I couldn't shake the image of Lily's smile, that familiar dimple that had appeared when she grinned. My mother's dimple. My dimple, visible in the rare photographs where I allowed myself to be captured in an unguarded moment. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure folder where I kept personal documents, birth certificates, my mother's death certificate, old family photos I'd digitized years ago and rarely looked at. There were so few of them. My mother had never been one for extensive documentation, and after she passed, I'd been too busy managing the company's expansion into European markets to properly sort through her belongings. One photograph caught my eye, a faded color print from the early 1990s showing my mother at what appeared to be a family gathering. I zoomed in on the faces, searching for clues. There, in the background, was a young woman who resembled the Margaret Donovan whose grave Lily had been visiting. And beside her stood a teenage boy with the same serious expression and dark eyes I'd just seen in Lily. My thumb hovered over the screen. The boy would be about the right age now to be Lily's father, Thomas. But who was he to me? To my mother? I had grown up believing I was an only child, that my mother had never married, that it had always been just the two of us against the world. I closed the photo app and dialed a number I rarely used. Jimmy? Patricia Holloway's surprised voice answered on the third ring. She was my mother's oldest friend, the one person from that past life I still exchanged Christmas cards with out of some sense of obligation. Is everything all right? You never call on Fridays. I never call at all, Pat. Let's be honest, I replied, running a hand through my hair. The cemetery was coming alive now with groundskeepers and the occasional visitor. I need to ask you something about Mom. Elizabeth. A pause. What about her? Did she ever mention someone named Thomas Donovan? Or Margaret Donovan? The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Patricia sighed, a heavy sound laden with what I suddenly recognized as decades of kept secrets. Where are you, Jimmy? She asked instead of answering. At Oakwood. At Mom's grave. Stay there. I'll come to you. She hung up before I could protest. While waiting, I paced the paths between gravestones, my mind whirling with possibilities. The pieces were there, but the picture they formed seemed impossible. My mother had been meticulous about certain things, my education, our modest but dignified lifestyle, the values she instilled in me. Could she have hidden something so significant? More importantly, why would she? Patricia arrived 40 minutes later, her silver Volvo pulling up to the cemetery gates. I watched her approach, noting how she'd aged since I'd last seen her at the Christmas charity dinner 2 years ago. She'd been my mother's confidant since their college days, the one person Mom had trusted implicitly. You look like hell, Jimmy, were her first words, appraising me with the frank assessment that had always made me slightly uncomfortable around her. When's the last time you slept properly? I'm not here to discuss my sleep habits, Pat. The edge in my voice was sharper than I'd intended. I met someone today, a little girl named Lily Donovan. She was visiting her grandmother's grave. Margaret Donovan. Patricia's face remained carefully neutral, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. And she has my mother's smile. My smile. I held Patricia's gaze. The grave is close to our family plot. Too close for coincidence. Patricia looked away, her eyes traveling over the cemetery as if searching for an escape route. Finding none, she sighed and gestured toward the bench I'd vacated. We should sit. We settled side by side, the morning sun now high enough to warm our shoulders. A magpie landed nearby, its black and white feathers gleaming as it pecked at something in the grass. Your mother would kill me for telling you this, Patricia began, her voice low. But I suppose she's not here to do that, is she? She turned to face me fully. Thomas Donovan is your half-brother, Jimmy. The words hit me with physical force. I'd suspected something along these lines from the moment I saw Lily's smile, yet hearing it stated so plainly made me feel as though the ground beneath me had suddenly vanished. Half-brother, I repeated numbly. How? When? Before you were born. Elizabeth was young, just 19. She fell in love with a boy from Southie, Michael Donovan. His mother was Margaret, the woman whose grave the little girl was visiting. Patricia's voice softened with memory. They were going to get married, but Michael was drafted. Vietnam. He didn't come home. I struggled to reconcile this information with the mother I knew, practical, determined, focused on building a secure future for us. She never mentioned him. Not once. Grief does strange things to people, Patricia said gently. By the time I met Elizabeth at Boston College, she was pregnant with you and determined to make it on her own. Michael had been gone almost 2 years by then. And Thomas? I pressed, trying to follow the timeline. If Michael died before I was born, Michael had a younger brother, Sean. After Michael died, he stepped up to help Elizabeth with Thomas, who was just a baby. They were never romantic, but Sean made sure his nephew knew his father's family. Patricia's eyes held a sadness I couldn't quite interpret. When Elizabeth got pregnant with you a few years later, it complicated things. Your biological father wasn't in the picture, and Elizabeth felt pulled between two worlds. My mind reeled with implications. She chose me, I stated flatly. She left Thomas with this Sean person and chose me. Patricia shook her head sharply. That's not how it was, Jimmy. Elizabeth wanted to keep both of you, but Sean's family had legal custody of Thomas by then. There were difficulties. Your mother was working multiple jobs, taking classes. Sean's parents, the Donovans, they had a stable home, money. They could give Thomas opportunities. So she gave him up. The idea was difficult to grasp. My mother, who had sacrificed everything for me, had another son she'd relinquished. She didn't give him up, Patricia corrected firmly. She made an impossible choice that she thought was best for both her children. She remained part of Thomas's life for years, holidays, birthdays. The Donovans were decent people. They never tried to cut her out. Then what happened? I demanded, feeling a surge of something between anger and grief. Why didn't I know about any of this? Why didn't I grow up knowing I had a brother? Patricia's face clouded. When you were about 10, Elizabeth got the job at Brigham and Women's Hospital, the administrative position that finally gave her some financial stability. She started talking about seeking joint custody of Thomas. But by then, Sean had married, moved to Chicago with his wife and Thomas. The Donovans, Margaret and her husband, they followed to be near their grandson. I remembered that period vaguely, my mother working long hours, seeming distracted and sad for months. I'd attributed it to the demands of her new job. Never once had I imagined she was grieving the loss of another child. When they moved back to Boston 7 years later, you were in college at MIT, already launching your first startup, Patricia continued. Elizabeth tried to reconnect with Thomas, but too much time had passed. He had his own life, his own family identity. And you, she hesitated. What about me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You were so driven, so focused on your future. Your mother was proud of you, but she worried about disrupting your life with complicated family history. She always meant to tell you when the time was right. And when exactly was that supposed to be? I stood abruptly, anger rising like a tide. After she died? Was that the right time? Patricia remained seated, her calm a counterpoint to my agitation. She tried, Jimmy. That last year, when she was asking you to come for dinner, to spend weekends at her place, she wasn't just being a lonely mother. She wanted to tell you everything. The realization hit me with crushing force. Those ignored invitations, the calls returned days later, the visits cut short because of urgent business, all opportunities lost forever. My mother had died trying to share her truth with me, while I had been too absorbed in quarterly projections to give her the time. Does he know about me? I asked, my voice barely audible. This Thomas, does he know he has a half-brother who runs a tech empire? Yes, Patricia said simply. Elizabeth kept him updated on your achievements. She had photos of both her sons on her mantelpiece. The image was jarring, my mother in her modest Jamaica plain apartment, looking at pictures of 2 separate lives she'd created. Had she compared us? Wondered what might have been if circumstances had been different? Had she loved him as she loved me? And the girl, Lily? Thomas's daughter. Elizabeth met her a few times before she passed. She adored her. Patricia's expression softened. She's the spitting image of your mother at that age. I sank back onto the bench, overcome. Not just a half-brother, but a niece. Family I'd never known existed, living in the same city, breathing the same air, carrying the same blood and features. While I'd been building Morgan Innovations, constructing glass and steel monuments to my success, an entirely different legacy had been unfolding parallel to mine. I want to meet him, I said suddenly, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Thomas. I want to meet my brother. Patricia studied me, her expression guarded. Are you sure that's wise, Jimmy? You've built a life that's very different from his. He works on the docks, lives paycheck to paycheck. The contrast might be difficult for both of you. I don't care, I said, and meant it. For the first time in years, the trappings of my success, the penthouse, the company, the influence, felt hollow compared to this revelation. He's my brother. Lily is my niece. They're family. Patricia nodded slowly, reaching into her bag for her phone. I'll talk to him. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. She stood, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. Elizabeth would be glad, you know. Despite everything, she never stopped hoping her boys might someday know each other. As Patricia walked away to make her call, I turned toward my mother's grave, seeing it with new eyes. The simple headstone I'd chosen seemed inadequate now, failing to capture the complexity of the woman who had carried such secrets, made such sacrifices. I'd thought I was honoring her memory by building a successful company, by achieving the financial security she'd always wanted for me. Now I wondered if I'd missed the point entirely, if what she truly valued wasn't wealth or achievement, but connection, family, love that persisted despite impossible circumstances. I wondered what Thomas Donovan saw when he looked at his daughter's smile, if he recognized our mother there, if he felt the same mixture of love and loss that had begun to unfurl inside me. I wondered what he'd been told about me, what version of James Morgan existed in his mind. I remained by my mother's grave, waiting for Patricia to return with news that would either open a door to an unknown past or confirm that some bridges, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. Either way, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The carefully constructed narrative of my life had been shattered in the space of a morning, revealing hidden chambers I hadn't known existed. And somewhere in Boston, a dock worker named Thomas Donovan was about to receive a call that would upend his world just as thoroughly as mine had been. Patricia returned 20 minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. "He's willing to meet you," she said without preamble. "Sunday afternoon at Castle Island. He takes Lily there sometimes for ice cream after visiting the cemetery." I nodded, suddenly unable to form words. The reality of what was happening seemed to crash over me like a physical wave. A brother, a niece, a whole branch of my family tree that had been growing parallel to mine, unseen and unacknowledged. "Thank you," I managed finally. Patricia squeezed my arm, then left me alone with my thoughts and my mother's grave. I didn't return to the office that day. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly through Boston streets, past places that had featured in my childhood, the community center where Mom had worked weekends for extra cash, the small park where she'd taught me to throw a baseball, the public library where I'd spent countless hours while she picked up evening shifts at the diner. I ended up at her old apartment building in Jamaica Plain, a modest 3-story structure with fire escapes zigzagging up the brick facade. She'd lived there until her death, refusing my repeated offers to buy her a better place in a more upscale neighborhood. "This is home, Jamie," she'd always said. "I don't need fancy." I'd cleared out the apartment after she died, a task I'd delegated largely to a professional service. Now I wondered what I might have missed, what photos, letters, or mementos might have revealed this hidden history if I'd taken the time to look through them myself. The thought made me feel sick with regret. On impulse, I drove to my storage facility in Back Bay, where I kept the few boxes of my mother's possessions I hadn't donated or discarded. The climate-controlled unit was packed with artifacts of my own life, furniture from my first apartment, artwork I'd bought but had no place for in my minimalist penthouse, awards and plaques commemorating business achievements. And there, almost forgotten in the back corner, 4 cardboard boxes labeled simply Mom. I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, surrounded by the physical remnants of my mother's life. The first box contained kitchenware, her battered KitchenAid mixer, a set of measuring cups, the ceramic teapot she'd loved. The second held books, mostly dog-eared paperbacks with cracked spines that spoke of multiple readings. I'd forgotten how much she loved mysteries and historical fiction, how she'd stay up late reading despite early shifts the next day. The third box held clothing I hadn't been able to part with, her faded Red Sox sweatshirt, the blue cashmere sweater I'd given her for Christmas the year my first company went public, the silk scarf she'd worn to my MIT graduation. I lifted each item, remembering how they'd looked on her, how they'd smelled of her lavender perfume. It was the fourth box that yielded the treasures I hadn't known to look for. Beneath layers of greeting cards and newspaper clippings celebrating my business success was a leather-bound photo album I didn't recognize. Opening it, I found myself looking at a younger version of my mother, perhaps 18 or 19, arm in arm with a young man in a military uniform. They were standing on what looked like Castle Island, the same place where I was supposed to meet Thomas on Sunday. The young man was handsome in a rugged way, with dark eyes and a serious expression that only softened when he looked at my mother. Michael Donovan. It had to be. Thomas's father, the man who had died in Vietnam before I was born. I turned pages slowly, watching their love story unfold in faded color photographs, at Fenway Park, on the beach at Revere, at what appeared to be a family dinner with older people who must have been the Donovans. My mother looked happier than I'd ever seen her, radiant with the kind of joy I'd rarely witnessed in our pragmatic, work-focused life together. About halfway through the album, the photos changed. Michael disappeared, and in his place was a baby Thomas, I realized with a jolt. My half-brother as an infant, cradled in my mother's arms. A toddler Thomas taking wobbly steps toward a young man who had to be Sean, Michael's brother. Thomas blowing out candles on a birthday cake, my mother watching from the side, her smile tinged with what I now recognized as sadness. And then, abruptly, a new sequence began. My mother pregnant, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Me as a newborn, tiny and red-faced in a hospital bassinet. For a few pages, the photos showed both children, Thomas, about 3 years old, peering curiously at baby me, my mother holding both of us with an expression of complex emotion I couldn't fully decipher. After that, the pictures separated. Thomas appeared less frequently, always in what seemed to be planned visits, at a park, at the beach, at what looked like a Christmas gathering. The final photo of him in the album showed a boy of about 9 or 10, standing awkwardly beside my mother outside Fenway Park. Even through the faded image, I could see the distance between them, the tentative quality of their connection. I closed the album, feeling as though I'd intruded on a private grief. All those years, my mother had carried this loss inside her, a son given up not through choice but circumstance, a life bifurcated by forces beyond her control. It explained so much about her that I'd never understood, her occasional melancholy on holidays, her insistence on keeping up relationships with old friends like Patricia who connected her to her past, her fierce determination that I would never want for anything. Beneath the album was a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. With trembling fingers, I untied the bow and opened the top envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper yellowed with age. "Dear Lizzie," it began. "The jungle here is like nothing I've ever seen. The guys say you get used to the heat, but 3 months in and I'm still sweating through everything. I think about you every night. About our plans. About the little house in Dorchester we talked about getting when I come home. Michael's letters from Vietnam." I carefully refolded, unable to continue reading such intimate thoughts. These weren't meant for my eyes. But their existence prompted another realization. I'd never really known my mother as a person separate from her role as my parent. I'd never thought to ask about her dreams beyond raising me, her heartbreaks beyond the daily struggles of our life together. Deeper in the box, I found more recent items, a child's drawing signed, "To Grandma, Love Lily," in uneven block letters. A Christmas card with a family photo showing Thomas as an adult, standing beside a petite woman with Lily between them, all smiling at the camera. Thomas had my mother's eyes, I realized with a start. The same shape, the same directness of gaze. Lily had her smile. On the back of the card was a handwritten note. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Wish you could be here with us. Maybe next year?" The date was December 2019, just months before my mother's sudden death. Had she been planning to finally bring her separate worlds together? Had she been working up the courage to introduce me to the family I never knew I had? I remembered our last conversation, a rushed phone call where she'd tried to tell me something important, and I'd cut her off, promising to visit soon but preoccupied with a product launch. Had she been trying to tell me about Thomas and Lily? Had she known our time was running out? The storage facility's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I carefully repacked the boxes, placing the photo album and letters on top where I could easily retrieve them. Night had fallen outside, the Back Bay streets glowing with restaurant signs and headlights. I hadn't eaten all day, hadn't checked my phone in hours. None of that seemed to matter now. As I drove back to my Beacon Hill penthouse, I felt like a different person than the man who had visited his mother's grave that morning, a man who had believed he understood his origins, his family history, the shape of his life. Now everything seemed less certain. The bedrock of my identity shifted by revelations I was still struggling to process. Sundays suddenly felt both too close and infinitely far away. How did one prepare to meet a brother they never knew existed? What could possibly bridge decades of separation, of lives lived in entirely different worlds? I parked in my reserved spot beneath the luxury building where I lived, nodding mechanically to the doorman as I passed. The elevator carried me to the top floor in smooth silence, delivering me to an apartment that suddenly felt cavernous and cold despite its carefully curated design and museum-quality art. I'd always taken pride in this space, in the success it represented. Now I wondered what my mother had really thought when she visited here, whether she'd seen it as an achievement or merely another manifestation of the divide between her two sons, one ensconced in wealth, the other working on the docks to support his family. That night, I dreamed of Castle Island, not as it existed now, but as it appeared in those old photographs of my mother and Michael Donovan. In the dream, I was both observer and participant, watching my young mother laugh with Michael while simultaneously feeling the sand beneath my own feet, the wind on my face. "You'll understand someday," she said in the dream, but whether she was speaking to me or to the ghost of Michael, I couldn't tell. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that Boston offers in early fall, bright sunshine cutting through morning fog, the harbor a deep, impossibly blue canvas dotted with white sails. I'd barely slept since Friday, spending much of Saturday poring over the contents of those boxes, piecing together the fragments of my mother's other life, the one that had run parallel to the story I knew. I dressed with uncharacteristic indecision, changing multiple times before settling on what I hoped was appropriately casual, dark jeans, and a simple navy sweater that my assistant Diane had once told me made me look like a regular person instead of a tech overlord. No watch, no cufflinks, nothing that screamed wealth or status. Today wasn't about James Morgan, CO. It was about Jamie, Elizabeth Morgan's son, meeting his brother for the first time. Castle Island wasn't actually an island anymore, but a peninsula extending into Boston Harbor, crowned by the star-shaped Fort Independence and ringed by a promenade that offered spectacular views of the water. I arrived early, parking in the lot near Sullivan's, the iconic seaside shack that had been serving hot dogs and soft-serve to Bostonians since the 1950s. My mother had brought me here. Sometimes when I was young, a rare treat on days when her budget allowed for small indulgences. I walked along the harbor side, watching families spread blankets on the grass, couples strolling hand in hand, children chasing seagulls with wild abandon. The normalcy of it all felt surreal against the thundering of my heart. Somewhere in this crowd might be my brother, my niece, strangers who shared my blood, my history. Patricia had described Thomas as about your height, darker hair, usually wearing a Red Sox cap. Not much to go on in a park filled with Boston sports fans. I found a bench facing the water and sat, trying to calm my racing thoughts. What would I say? How could words possibly bridge the chasm of our separate lives? I checked my watch, 12:45. They'd be here at 1. I thought of the photo album tucked into my glove compartment, wondering if I should have brought it. Would Thomas want to see these glimpses of his parents together, these memories preserved by a woman who had loved and lost his father? Or would it feel like salt in old wounds, a reminder of all he'd missed? Mr. Morgan? The voice came from behind me, tentative, but with an undertone of confidence that reminded me startlingly of my mother. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was unmistakably my brother. Not because we looked particularly alike, his features were more angular than mine, his complexion a shade darker, his build more solid from physical labor. But something in the set of his shoulders, the directness of his gaze, pure Elizabeth Morgan. He wore worn jeans, work boots, and yes, a faded Red Sox cap, precisely as Patricia had described. Beside him stood Lily, her hand tucked trustingly in his, her eyes wide as she recognized me from our cemetery encounter. "Thomas," I managed, standing and extending my hand on autopilot. "Please, call me James." Or Jamie. Mom called me Jamie. He hesitated just a beat before taking my hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who worked with boats and ropes and tools, not keyboards and touchscreens. Tommy, he offered in return. Nobody calls me Thomas except when I'm in trouble. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. This is my daughter, Lily. Though I hear you two have already met. Hi again, Lily chirped, seemingly unaffected by the tension crackling between the adults. Dad says you're my uncle. I didn't know I had an uncle. I didn't know I was an uncle, I replied honestly, finding it easier to address the child than the man who shared my mother's eyes. It's nice to officially meet you, Lily. An awkward silence descended. A seagull screamed overhead, diving for a discarded French fry on the walkway. Ice cream, Tommy finally suggested, nodding toward Sullivan's. That's usually why we come here. Sunday tradition. Sounds perfect, I agreed, grateful for the simple objective. We walked toward the concession stand, Lily skipping ahead while Tommy and I maintained a careful distance between us. The silence felt populated with unasked questions, unspoken accusations. She doesn't know all of it, Tommy said quietly, nodding toward his daughter. Just that you're her grandmother's other son. She's too young for the complicated parts. I nodded, understanding. This is surreal, I admitted. 2 days ago, I thought I was an only child. Tommy's jaw tightened. Yeah, well, I've known about you my whole life. There it was, the first hint of resentment, of pain. I couldn't blame him. While I'd been ignorant of his existence, he'd grown up in the shadow of a successful half-brother, watching from a distance as I achieved the kind of success that had probably seemed impossible from his vantage point. I didn't know, I said simply. Mom never told me. If she had, what? Tommy interrupted, his voice still low but intensity simmering beneath the surface. You'd have tracked me down? Invited me to your fancy tech parties? Let's not pretend, Morgan. Morgan. Not Jamie. Not even James. The distance in that choice of name felt deliberate, a boundary drawn. We reached Sullivan's, where Lily was already pressed against the counter, studying the ice cream options with the serious concentration only children can devote to such decisions. Tommy stepped up to order, effectively ending our stilted conversation. I watched him interact with the server, easy, friendly, the kind of natural charm that made people smile back automatically. Another trait from our mother. Armed with ice cream cones, chocolate for Lily, vanilla for Tommy, coffee for me, we made our way to a picnic table overlooking the harbor. Lily dominated the conversation, filling the awkward silences with tales of school, friends, and her soccer team's recent victory. I listened gratefully, stealing glances at Tommy, trying to reconcile this stranger with the baby in those old photographs, with the concept of brother that had never existed in my reality. So you run Morgan Innovations, Tommy finally said when Lily paused for breath. Medical tech, right? I see your billboards sometimes. Yes, I confirmed, surprised he knew that much. We develop neural interface systems for medical applications. Helping people with spinal injuries regain mobility, that sort of thing. Tommy nodded, his expression unreadable. Mom was proud of you. Used to show me articles about your company whenever they appeared in the Globe. The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. My mother, sharing my accomplishments with her other son, trying to maintain some connection between her separated children, even if only through newspaper clippings. She never told me about you, I said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words. I wish she had. She tried, Tommy replied, surprising me. That last year. She called me a few times, talking about telling you everything, bringing us together for a holiday or something. He shrugged, focusing on his ice cream cone. I told her not to bother. That it was too late for happy reunions. The revelation stung more than I expected. Why? I asked, unsure if I really wanted the answer. Tommy looked at me then, really looked at me, as if measuring whether I deserved the truth. Because I resented the hell out of you, he said simply. The golden child. The one she chose. She didn't choose me over you, I protested, remembering Patricia's words. The Donovans had custody, that's what she told you? Tommy interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping him. Mom always did like to clean things up. He glanced at Lily, who had wandered a few feet away to watch a sailboat cutting through the harbor. Look, I'm not here to argue about ancient history. Mom loved us both, in her way. She did what she thought was best. End of story. But it wasn't the end. That much was clear from the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided meeting my eyes. There were wounds here that went deeper than I'd imagined, truths more complex than what Patricia had shared. I want to understand, I said quietly. All of it. The good and the bad. Tommy studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Why? So you can feel better about inheriting everything while I got nothing? So you can assuage your billionaire guilt by playing Big Brother now? That's not fair, I began, then stopped myself. From his perspective, nothing about this situation was fair. I just found out I have family I never knew existed. Is it so strange that I'd want to know them? Lily isn't a prop for your journey of self-discovery, Tommy said flatly. And neither am I. I never suggested Uncle Jamie. Lily called, racing back to our table. Can you come see the boat with me? Dad says that kind is a catch and it has a special mast or something. The abrupt shift left me momentarily disoriented. Tommy gave a slight nod, permission granted. I stood and followed Lily to the railing overlooking the harbor, grateful for the respite from the tense conversation. That's a mizzen mast, I said, pointing to the smaller second mast on the sailboat cutting through the harbor. My college roommate was a sailor. He taught me a bit about boats. Lily nodded seriously. Dad knows everything about boats. He fixes them at the marina. Sometimes he takes me out on Mr. Peterson's sailboat when he's testing the engine. I glanced back at Tommy, who was watching us with an unreadable expression. Your dad seems like a good father, I said honestly. He's the best, Lily confirmed without hesitation. Even when he works really late, he always comes to tuck me in. And he never misses my soccer games, not even when it rains. The simple statement contained multitudes, a lifetime of small sacrifices and consistent love that formed the foundation of Lily's sense of security. I thought of my own childhood, comfortable by most standards, but defined by my mother's frequent absences as she worked multiple jobs. Had Tommy made a deliberate choice to prioritize presence over prosperity in a way our mother couldn't? When we returned to the table, something in Tommy's demeanor had shifted. He seemed to have reached some internal decision during our brief absence. Here's the deal, he said abruptly. I agreed to this meeting because Patricia said you deserve to know the truth. But I'm not looking for a relationship. I've got my life, you've got yours. They don't intersect. The bluntness was both shocking and oddly refreshing after years of corporate diplomacy where no one ever said exactly what they meant. What about Lily? I asked, nodding toward my niece, who was now chasing seagulls a few yards away. She's my niece. Tommy's expression softened slightly as he watched his daughter. She's a good kid. She deserves to know her family, what's left of it. He turned back to me, his gaze direct. But I need to be clear about something. If you want to be in her life, even occasionally, it can't be halfway. No disappearing when something more important comes up at work. No extravagant gifts to compensate for absence. She's had enough people drift in and out. The implicit criticism was unmistakable and not entirely undeserved. Wasn't that exactly how I treated my relationship with my mother in her final years? I understand, I said, meaning it. I won't make promises I can't keep. Tommy nodded once, a businesslike gesture that reminded me incongruously of my own boardroom demeanor. Good. Now, if you really want to know about Mom, the parts she never told you, I'll meet you. Alone. Next week. There are things Lily doesn't need to hear. I agreed immediately, sensing this was as much of an opening as I was likely to get. We exchanged numbers, a strangely formal transaction between brothers, and made tentative plans to meet at a bar in South Boston the following Friday. As our awkward encounter drew to a close, Lily surprised me by throwing her arms around my waist in an impulsive hug. By Uncle Jamie, she exclaimed, her smile, my mother's smile, flashing up at me. Will you come to my soccer game sometime? Over her head, Tommy and I exchanged a look, his cautioning, mine questioning. He gave a slight nod, a concession that felt like both a responsibility and a gift. "I'd like that," I told her, meaning it more than I'd expected to. "If your dad thinks it's okay." As I watched them walk away across the park, Tommy's hand protectively on Lily's shoulder, I felt a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully identify. Relief that the first meeting was over. Anticipation of the harder conversations to come. And something else, a strange, unexpected sense of connection to these strangers who were somehow family. I realized with sudden clarity that I'd come here seeking answers about my past, about my mother's choices and secrets. But what I'd found instead was a question about my future, about what kind of brother, what kind of uncle, what kind of man I wanted to be. The week crawled by, each day stretching into an eternity of meetings I couldn't focus on and decisions I made on autopilot. Diane noticed the change in me, her concerned glances following me as I moved through the motions of running Morgan Innovations. "Are you sure you're all right, Mr. Morgan?" she asked more than once, unused to seeing me distracted, uncertain. I deflected her questions with practiced ease, but the truth was I felt fundamentally altered. Every aspect of my carefully constructed life seemed suddenly hollow, built on a foundation that had cracked beneath me. My sleek office with its harbor views, the board members who deferred to my every suggestion, the teams of brilliant engineers executing my vision, all of it felt somehow less substantial than the brief, awkward conversation I'd had with Tommy at Castle Island. Friday evening found me in a small, unpretentious bar in Southie, the Lucky Shamrock, a neighborhood institution that had probably looked exactly the same for the past 30 years. Dark wood, sports memorabilia covering the walls, the kind of place where everybody really did know everybody's name. I felt conspicuously out of place despite my deliberate choice of casual clothing. Tommy was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer at a corner table. He nodded when he saw me, his expression guarded but not hostile. I ordered a whiskey at the bar and joined him, uncomfortably aware of the curious glances from the regulars. Did they recognize me from business profiles in the Globe, or was I simply obviously an outsider in this close-knit community? "Thanks for coming," I said, settling into the chair across from him. Tommy shrugged. "Said I would." He took a long pull from his beer. "Patricia tells me you found Mom's photo albums. The old ones." I nodded, surprised at the directness. "Yes, I didn't know she kept all that. Pictures of your father, of you as a baby. Letters from Vietnam." A flash of something of pain? Interest? Crossed Tommy's face. "Never saw those myself. She kept them locked away after I moved to Chicago with Dad, with Sean, I mean." The correction was telling. "Sean raised you as his son?" Tommy nodded. "Good man. Married Maureen when I was about 4. They had 2 kids of their own eventually, my half-sisters. But he never treated me any different. Adopted me legally before we moved to Chicago." He traced a pattern in the condensation on his glass. "That's the part Mom probably never told you. It wasn't just the Donovans who had custody. Sean legally became my father." I absorbed this new information, trying to align it with the story Patricia had shared. "But you kept the Donovan name?" Sean thought I should. "To honor my birth father's memory." Tommy's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "The official name is Thomas Sean Donovan. Mom and Sean compromised on that." The mention of compromise made me think of what Patricia had told me, how my mother had tried to maintain a relationship with Tommy even after the separation. "So you stayed in touch with Mom? Even in Chicago?" Tommy nodded. "Phone calls. Birthday cards. She visited a couple of times a year. It was civil. Awkward, but civil. The adults tried to make it normal for me." He sipped his beer thoughtfully. "Looking back, I can see how hard it must have been for her. But kids don't think about that stuff. I just knew she was my mom who lived far away, and Sean and Maureen were my parents who took care of me every day." It was a remarkably balanced perspective for someone who had effectively lost his mother at a young age. "You don't seem angry at her," I observed. Tommy's expression hardened slightly. "I went through my angry phase in my teens when we moved back to Boston. Suddenly she wanted more time with me, wanted to introduce me to you. I wasn't having it." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Because by then, I'd pieced together enough to know that she'd made a choice. When Sean got the job offer in Chicago, she could have fought harder to keep me in Boston. Could have insisted on joint custody. But she had you by then, was building a life for the two of you. He shrugged. Teenage me decided that meant she'd chosen you over me. The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. She didn't, I said automatically. Patricia told me. Patricia tells the version Mom wanted her to tell. Tommy interrupted, not unkindly. Look, I'm not saying Mom was a villain. She was young, struggling, trying to do right by everyone. But facts are facts. When Sean wanted to move to Chicago with me, she signed the papers. She chose to let me go with him rather than fight for shared custody. I sat back, trying to reconcile this perspective with the mother I'd known, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities, who had worked herself to exhaustion to pay for my education. Why would she do that? I asked, more to myself than to Tommy. To my surprise, Tommy's expression softened. Because she thought it was best for me. Sean and Maureen could give me stability, a two-parent home, financial security. Mom was working 3 jobs just to keep you guys afloat in that Jamaica Plain apartment. He took another sip of his beer. It took me years to understand that sometimes love looks like letting go. The wisdom in his words caught me off guard. This man I'd expected to be bitter, resentful. Instead, he'd achieved a level of understanding about our mother's choices that I, with all my supposed success, hadn't approached. When did you forgive her? I asked quietly. Tommy laughed, a short, surprised sound. Who says I have? It's complicated, man. I can understand her choices and still wish she'd made different ones. He studied me for a moment. How about you? You forgiven her yet for keeping me a secret all these years? The question blindsided me. I hadn't thought of it in terms of forgiveness. My shock and confusion had been directed more at the situation than at my mother herself. I don't know, I admitted. I'm still processing the fact that everything I thought I knew about our family was only half the story. Welcome to the club, Tommy said dryly. Been a member since I was 10. Something about his tone, not accusatory, but matter-of-fact, broke the tension between us. I found myself smiling, and after a moment, Tommy's mouth quirked in what might have been a responding smile. So, he said, gesturing to the bartender for another round. Patricia tells me you're some kind of genius. Neural interfaces? That's straight-up sci-fi stuff. The shift in conversation was clearly deliberate, but I was grateful for it. It's not as futuristic as it sounds. We're just finding ways to help the brain communicate with technology to compensate for physical limitations. Helping paraplegics walk again, stroke victims regain speech function, that kind of thing. Tommy nodded, surprising me with his apparent interest. Mom said something about that last time we talked. Said you were doing good work, helping people. The casual mention of our mother's approval warmed me unexpectedly. I try, I said. Though lately I've been wondering if I've lost sight of the original mission. These days it's more about stock prices and market share than actually changing lives. The admission wasn't one I'd have made to anyone at Morgan Innovations, but here in this dimly lit bar, with this unexpected brother, honesty seemed the only possible currency. Tommy considered me with a directness that reminded me painfully of our mother. So change it back, he said simply. You're the boss, right? The big shot CEO? I laughed despite myself. It's not that simple. We have shareholders. A board sounds like excuses to me. Tommy cut in, but his tone was light, almost teasing. Mom always said you could do anything you set your mind to. Jamie's stubborn as a mule, just like his brother, she used to say. The casual revelation that our mother had seen similarities between us struck me with unexpected force. I'd spent the past week imagining all the ways Tommy and I were different, the dock worker versus the tech mogul, the family man versus the isolated executive. It hadn't occurred to me that she might have seen parallels where I saw only contrasts. What else did she say about me? I asked, curiosity overcoming caution. Tommy's expression turned thoughtful. Said you were brilliant but lonely. Driven but lost sometimes. Said you reminded her of my father in that way, Michael, I mean. All intensity, no off switch. He glanced at me. She worried about you. Said you worked too hard, didn't have anyone looking out for you. It was a devastatingly accurate assessment, all the more painful coming from a mother who had clearly seen through my carefully maintained facade of success and self-sufficiency. She was right, I admitted, the whiskey perhaps loosening my usual reserve. I've built this company, this fortune, and for what? I wake up in an empty penthouse, work 14-hour days with people who fear me more than they like me, then go home and do it all again the next day. Tommy studied me for a long moment. You know what I think? I think you and me, we both got half of what we needed. I got family, but struggled for money and opportunity. You got success, but missed out on connection. He shrugged. Maybe that's what Mom saw when she looked at us, two halves of what she wanted for both her sons. The insight was profound in its simplicity. I thought of my sprawling penthouse with its minimal furnishings and pristine surfaces, a showcase more than a home. And I thought of the glimpse I'd had of Tommy's life, modest means perhaps, but rich in the things that mattered. Lily's unwavering certainty that her father would always be there, the casual references to soccer games and bedtime routines, the evidence of a life built around relationships rather than achievements. Lily's a great kid, I said, changing the subject slightly. You've done a good job with her. Tommy's face softened visibly. She's everything. After Rachel, my wife, left, Lily was the reason I got up every morning. Still is. He glanced at me. Mom would have loved to see you two together. She always said Lily reminded her of you at that age, too smart for her own good, always asking why. The casual revelation that my mother had seen a resemblance between my niece and me created an unexpected lump in my throat. I'm sorry I didn't know her, Mom. I mean, the way you did, I said quietly. I was so busy building my empire that I missed the chance to really know my own mother. Tommy's expression turned unexpectedly gentle. She understood, you know. She was proud of you, bragged about you to anyone who would listen. My Jamie, he's changing the world with his inventions. She kept every article, every mention of your company. But I wasn't there when she needed me, I said, the truth I'd been avoiding finally surfacing. When she tried to reach out that last year, I was too busy. And then she was gone. Tommy was quiet for a moment, contemplating his fear. We all have regrets when it comes to Mom, he finally said. I pushed her away for years, blamed her for choices she made before I was old enough to understand them. By the time I got my head straight, realized she was just doing her best in an impossible situation. He shrugged. Well, time runs out for all of us, doesn't it? The simple acknowledgement of our shared failings created a bridge between us that formal relationship never could have. For the first time, I felt a genuine connection to this man who shared my blood, not because we were similar, but because we had both loved and lost the same woman, had both failed her in our own ways. I have her photo albums, I said suddenly. Letters, mementos. Things she kept from both our childhoods. You should have them, or copies at least. Tommy looked surprised, then thoughtful. I'd like that. For Lily, if nothing else. She should know where she comes from, all of it. I'd like to be part of her life, I found myself saying. If you're okay with that. Not just the fun uncle who shows up with expensive gifts. Really part of her life. Tommy studied me for a long moment, as if weighing my sincerity. She has a soccer game next Saturday, he finally said. Nothing fancy. Just 8-year-olds running around a field in Dorchester. But she'd like it if you came. The invitation was tentative, conditional, but it felt like the beginning of something important. I'll be there, I promised. No meetings, no emergencies. Just an uncle watching his niece play soccer. As we finished our drinks, the conversation turned to lighter topics, the Red Sox's chances in the coming season, the best places to get Italian food in the North End, Lily's upcoming school science fair. It wasn't the easy camaraderie of brothers who had grown up together, but it was something, a foundation we could potentially build on. When we finally left the bar, the night air cool against my face, I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. My life had been defined by forward momentum, by the relentless pursuit of more success, more innovation, more wealth. I had never looked back. Never considered what I might have lost along the way. Same time next week? Tommy suggested as we prepared to go our separate ways. I'll bring those pictures of Mom from the Chicago years. You might want to see them." "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. As I watched him walk toward the subway station, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the night, I thought about the strange, unexpected gift my mother had given me, not just in the revelation of a brother and niece I'd never known, but in the opportunity to reconsider the legacy I wanted to build. Morgan Innovations had always been about pushing boundaries, creating technology that could change lives. Somewhere along the way, that mission had become secondary to growth metrics and market valuation. Perhaps it was time to recalibrate, to ensure that my mother's faith in me, her belief that I was changing the world, was justified. And perhaps it was also time to recognize that legacy wasn't measured solely in patents and profit margins. It existed in connections, in relationships, in showing up for soccer games and Sunday ice cream, and the small, consistent moments that formed the true architecture of a life well lived. As I drove back to my Beacon Hill penthouse, I realized I felt lighter than I had in years, as if by confronting the past I'd somehow freed myself from its grip. The brother I'd never known had given me an unexpected gift, a glimpse of a different way to measure success, a different way to honor our mother's memory. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was looking forward not to the next board meeting or product launch, but to something much simpler and infinitely more meaningful: watching an 8-year-old girl play soccer on a Saturday morning in Dorchester, cheering her on as her uncle, as family.